Hey everybody, I hope y'all are having a great week. As we go into our lesson for this week, we're going to be looking at right after the nation of Israel came over the Jordan River. Last week we looked at that. We saw the nation of Israel crossing the Jordan River. They came to the point, they crossed the river, they set up memorials to remember what God had done for them in crossing the Jordan. And we looked at that more in depth and how that the water didn't part until the priest's feet touched the water. So they had to step out in faith before anything happened. And sometimes that's how we have to do in our lives. So we're going to look and we're going to shift today to the nation of Israel preparing and being ready to go in and fight the first battle in the promised land. And that's going to be, we're going to see them fight Jericho. And we've probably heard that many times and heard the story many times of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. But we're going to look at that next week. But this week we're going to look at right before they go to the battle. And we're going to see what happens once this is the first time in the promised land, what they do. So we'll be reading from Joshua chapter 5, beginning in verse 10. We're going to read this in two sections. So Joshua 5, verse 10 through verse 12. When the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover, and on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land, and there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. So here we come, and we see the nation of Israel, and they're encamped. They're preparing for battle. Joshua's prepared them for battle right before. He circumcised all the people, which we didn't go into depth on, but he circumcised all the people because they weren't circumcised. And so to get them ready, because that's what separated Israel from the other nations. And so we're going to look and see that they observed their first Passover in the new land, in the promised land. Now, this is the moment that they've been waiting for, from the moment that Passover really first started. We got to remember that Passover was the time in the nation of Israel history. It was that final plague where that if the blood was on the side post of the door and the top of the door, that the Spirit of God would pass over and would spare that family. And so this is a throwback to the nation of whenever they were in Egypt. They were still, in Egypt right before they left. And the plague where the firstborn of every family was going to die. Firstborn son of every family was going to die. And so, they're remembering what God did to free them. They're remembering what God did to free them, to set them apart, to bring them to where they are today. And this is something they celebrate every year, and they still celebrate to this day. So you think about it, they'd probably celebrated 41 times over the time. But this is the first time that they celebrated while they were in the promised land. While they're in the land that God had promised them, that was flowing with milk and honey, with produce, with food, with all kinds of things that they could eat. This is what God had promised them, and they were here, and they were doing it. This is one of the most important holidays that Israel celebrates. And we see this throughout the Bible, that they always take the time to celebrate Passover. And so we kind of look at that, and we see this so much in our lives, in their lives. And we see that, once again, so they ate from the land. This is the first time they've actually been probably in a place that would grow materials. You think about it, they would grow food. They had wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, right? They wandered for 40 years. There was very little water. There was very little food that would grow out there. But yet, God provided manna for them, as we see, and He provided that for them early on in their wanderings. And so we saw that as we looked at the early on in our first couple lessons in this study. But we see that they ate of the food of the promised land. We ate of the food of the promised land, and we see that God stopped that. God stopped the manna from coming. So why did God stop the manna from coming? Well, God stopped the manna because they were where they were supposed to be. They were in a place where he no longer needed to provide this for them. They could do it for themselves. They could go out and harvest the grain, plant food, pick food off of trees, all these things that they could do now that they couldn't do before. So God provided them a way until they were to the point where they could be self-sufficient. They could do these things for themselves. They were able to eat the natural resources of the land. They didn't need the manna anymore. They had where they could go and make food and do the food themselves. And that's what we see in this passage. God provided that desert while they're wandering in the desert. They didn't have any other food. And then now the manna stops. The manna ceased. They don't need it anymore. They don't need it anymore. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the next part of this passage. Last couple verses, which are verses 13 through 15. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. So, this is a very interesting passage. So we see here, and we see Joshua. He's probably close to Jericho. He's out there. He's looking out. He can see Jericho in the distance. And he may be out there praying to God, seeking God's will, seeking God's intervening for the people on behalf of the people of Israel to have a successful battle. So he went out to kind of prepare himself, to psych himself up for battle, so that he could be, as we read in the first verse, be strong and courageous. Because, as we looked and we saw a couple weeks ago when we were talking about Rahab, the height of the city gates, of the city walls were high. They were thick. There was no way that they were going to do this by themselves. They needed God's help for this. So he's out there preparing. Then all of a sudden, someone appears. Not just anyone, but with sword in hand. So it appears like it's a warrior. So Joshua goes to this person. Just imagine it's night. You can't fully see what's going on, right? So it's nighttime. He's preparing to go into battle. He sees this person, and he doesn't fully see who they are, but he sees they got a sword, they got a weapon drawn. He asks, "Who are you? Are you for us or for our adversaries?" Because Joshua wanted to know. Joshua wanted to know. And so he knew how to handle it. So he knew if he needed to prepare to attack, or if he needed to, if he was okay, if it was a friend. But we see here that he doesn't come back and answer the question, "Yes, I'm for you," or "Yes," or "I'm for your enemies." He doesn't answer that question. He says that he's commander of the army of the Lord. Now, we don't know who this was. This very well could have been an angel that was coming down to appear to Joshua. We see angels appear to many people throughout the Bible as well, and they take the form of looking like humans for the most part. But we see that, and it's interesting to look and see this, more in depth. We see, Joshua's preparing for his attack on Jericho. He's there, he's thinking, he's praying, and then boom, this happens. He sees this person. He's startled, he's taken back. He's preparing to be strong and courageous. He doesn't sit there and run because the person's sword's drawn. He sits there, he stands, he takes a stand and asks who's there for. And the angel says he's the commander of the army of the Lord. Now, we see this, and we see this. So he probably was one of the angels that was in charge of the army that was going to help Joshua along the way. That was going to be there alongside of him. That was going to be unseen. That was going to help them in many different ways more than we could ever imagine. To be honest with you. He asked whose side he was on. And then we see that once he said that, he fell on his face. As with most encounters with angels in the Bible, people are fearful, right? We see this time and time again where, whether it's to the shepherds or to Mary or to other people throughout the Bible, people are scared when they encounter angels. They encounter these heavenly beings. And, but yet Joshua wasn't afraid. He fell on his face to worship because this was God's army. This was the commander of the Lord's army. And, And so Joshua asks him, and he says in here, and it's very telling of Joshua about what he says. He says in here, he says, "What does the Lord say to his servant?" He wanted to know what he needed to do, what he needed to say, where he needed to go, what his commands were. Because remember, the nation of Israel were to follow the commands of the Lord. They were to follow the commands, the will of the Lord, time in and time out. So Joshua's here, and this person who's the commander of the army of the Lord, this angel says to Joshua, whenever he asks what's he supposed to do, he said, "Take off your feet, for the place you are standing is holy ground." And time and time again, we think about that, and when we see that again, and whenever I first read this, and or whenever I read this recently, it harkened back to the story of Moses in the burning bush. A lot of times whenever there's encounters with angels at certain places, they tell people to take their shoes off because the place they're standing is holy ground. Is holy ground. And so that's what the angel told Moses, the burning bush told Moses in Exodus. And here in Joshua's told the same thing, to take his feet off because it's holy ground. And we said he took his feet off. He took his shoes off. He did. Because that was a holy place. That was how they viewed things that were holy. They didn't wear their shoes in the holy. He bowed down, worshipped God there, and took his feet off because he was in a holy place. We don't necessarily do that, but there's a lot of cultures that do that as well. Whenever they're going to a holy place, they take their shoes off and they leave them at the door, and then they come back and pick them up, after they get done praying whenever they go to church. So there's cultures that do that still today. So the question becomes, how can this apply to our lives? How can these short 5-6 verses in Joshua apply to us? Well, as we looked and we saw the observance of the Passover, let's really look at the true meaning of the reason why we celebrate holidays. We look at holidays like Christmas and Easter and all these other holidays that we celebrate, that we, come to worship. Let's look at the true meaning of them. So many times we get off track in these holidays. We get so focused on other things outside of the holiday, outside of the reason for it. Of course, Christmas we celebrate because of the birth of Christ. We get so focused on getting presents or getting gifts or, Santa Claus or all these other things that we forget about the true meaning. Easter, we get so focused on Easter egg hunts and all these other things that we forget to focus on the true meaning that Christ died for us on the cross and then rose again on the third day. So, let's remember the true reason for these holidays that we celebrate. They're remembering what happened to them and how God had brought them and the reason for the holiday. Let's do that as well. And focus on the true meaning, not on the meaning that the world puts to these holidays. The world puts to these holidays. And then, I look and I think of the second part that we talked about, where Joshua's encounter with the commander of the army of the Lord. Be sensitive to God. Be praying for what God's will is for your life. Don't just go and make decisions. Joshua could have not been here. He could have gone in knowing that the Lord was with him, knowing that God was with him, and gone straight to Jericho. But no, he took the time to pray to God about Jericho, to pray to God, to trust in God for that, to prepare himself for battle. We face a spiritual warfare out there that is unlike anything throughout history. Yes, people have faced spiritual battles throughout history, but yet we have so much access to things now than people used to. Through the internet, through technology, through all that stuff, we have access to easier ways for us to sin and no one know about it. And we face these spiritual battles that can pop up in any form. So just be prepared for your spiritual warfare. Be prepared. Be prepared. Pray to God. And, treat things correctly. Treat things holy. A lot of times it's one of those things where we sometimes don't treat holy things holy, whether it's communion or other things. We just kind of flippantly take it. Well, don't be doing that. Treat those things as holy, because it's important for us. It's that time for us to focus, to get back to where things are, and to humble ourselves before God. And so as we look and we look at those things that we celebrate. Like I said, we celebrate communion. We celebrate the Lord's Supper. It's time for us to reflect about what God has done and what He saved us from. So as we do that, just, don't take these things that we do lightly, but really think about the holiness behind them and how that it is holy ground and all that. So just remember that as we go throughout our lives, be looking for those. And then also, like I said, with the first thing, be looking for and remembering those things that God has done for us. We looked at that last week with the memorial they set up. Just be thinking about that. Be thinking about celebrating those things that God has done for us, whether it's coming to earth in the form of a baby we celebrate in Christmas, or it's Easter where He died on the cross to save us from our sins. Just remember those things. And remember them and focus on the true meaning of those as we go through our lives, so that we can show the world what the true meaning of those are as in our lives every day.